Hello, I'm Ed Fuquay, young adult librarian extraordinaire here at Woonsocket Harris Public Library.
And I'm Michaela, human being, here at Woonsocket Harris Public Library.
We're here with another episode of Booktalking.
Yes.
And we're going to talk about Charles Dickens.
Charles Dickens.
A very famous author.
Very, very famous. Of course, most well known, I think, for his Christmas story. But we're here to talk about the man.
Yes, the man himself. He was by far the most popular Victorian author. He was a huge literary superstar of his time. He's one of the most popular authors in the English language. When they had a poll in England of the top 100 books of all time, I believe 5 of his books made the top 100.
That is not shocking. He had some really, really famous works that are, still read today, still taught in schools today. His work is still very relevant.
Yeah, 15 novels. There have been hundreds of films, stage adaptations, television shows based on his work.
I even went to go see a stage production of Nicholas Nickleby a couple years ago. Yeah, no, it's still
Did
done.
you see the long one?
Oh, of course I saw the long one. It was about 6 hours long.
Yes, I was going to mention that. I was going to sort of name drop that if you had brought it up, because I was in England when I was in college, and I got to see it with the original cast in London.
That's amazing.
That's one of my few theatrical things that I can brag about.
Yeah, I can't really brag about mine. I saw it in Boston, but it was
still. I had to see Roger Rees and everybody. Yeah,
it's amazing, and sitting through it's 2 plays back to back with intermission in each one.
Intermission between. So he's famous for his complicated plots, books with lots of characters. He wrote, and there's often a mystery or crime element involved.
Oh, yeah.
So in a lot of ways, they're like crime thrillers.
Well, it kind of he is the originator of that sort of seedy London underbelly. Like, that is the theme for all of his novels. All of his novels feel like they could take place in the same world. Yeah.
Well, it's funny you mentioned that, too. Do you know there was a TV series based on that idea?
No, I didn't.
It's a TV series in England. It only lasted 1 season, so it might not have been very good. It never made it to America. But it was called Dickensian.
Dickensian.
Yes, and it's a TV series based on the premise that all of Dickens' books happened at the same time.
Well, I could definitely see that happening, but I'm just thinking that is a lot of cast and a lot of child actors.
It is. They didn't use every character, of course, but every single speaking part in there is from a Charles Dickens book.
That's fabulous.
Yeah.
That's excellent.
In fact, the word Dickensian, Dickens added that to the dictionary. That's used to describe literature if something is described as Dickensian in a review or something.
Well, I know that the term "what the Dickens," although not written by Dickens, was a Shakespearean term to mean like "call upon the devil," which Dickens apparently loved. He loved that his name was associated with this sort of demonic Shakespearean phrase. Yeah. But he was fascinating. Of course, born in 1812 on February 7th. He died June 9th, 1870, which is actually not that bad of a run for somebody living in that time period.
Particularly with the hardships he had in his life.
Oh my goodness, yes. Everything I read about Dickens over this past week has just been, how did he not die then? I know you were talking, you know more about the train crash.
He was involved in 2 train crashes in his life. One of them not that serious, and one of them a train derailed and went off a bridge into a river.
Yeah.
And Dickens dove off the bridge into the water and pulled people out. And he said later he had people who literally died in his arms.
Oh my God.
And the best part of the story is, after rescuing as many people as he could, before he left, he realized he'd left behind his manuscript of Great Expectations in the train carriage. So he had to go back into the wrecked train to grab his only copy of his manuscript.
Oh my God. Well, I'm happy he didn't let it,
I know.
burn.
Yeah. But that incident gave him post-traumatic stress, we'd call it today.
Yeah.
He couldn't ride in a train without having panic attacks. Even a carriage, the rocking motion would set him off sometimes.
Well, I totally understandable. I mean, I don't think a single person living today could go through what he went through and not come out with some form of trauma. It's funny because that train accident, in which he, in all respects should have died, especially with the amount of danger he put himself in, to, rescue people and, of course, save his manuscript. He died 5 years later on the exact same date of that train crash.
The anniversary of that train wreck, 5 years,
And he died while having dinner with one of his wife's sisters. He just dropped dead at the dinner table, which is just, for a fascinating man, it's just a very, very strange death. I know that in his life he had 10 children, which I know was not super duper uncommon for
not
that
uncommon.
time period. I know he had ridiculous nicknames for each one. The one that stuck out the most to me, as you were saying, was Skittles.
Skittles,
Skittles.
He never called his kids by their name, only their nicknames.
I don't know. Was that just to make his wife angry?
I don't know.
But Skittles, yes, and I did not know that it was not a colorful candy in the 1800s.
In those days, it was a pub game where you knocked over, small bowling pins with a ball on a string that you swung around. Yeah.
I have no idea how that child earned that name. I hope it's because they really liked the game.
Yeah, probably.
Yeah.
Yeah, he was full of weird, quirky things. Like he could only sleep if he was facing north.
Yeah, and he only wrote
facing north as well.
Yeah, because he thought just the ideas would flow better through his head if he was right.
That was his process. That was his writing process.
Well, maybe it worked. He had a very, like most of the children characters in his books, he had a pretty rocky and slightly traumatic childhood.
Yeah, not the worst by far.
Oh, definitely not the worst by far. His characters go through way worse.
Oh, his characters go through much worse.
Much, much worse. But his father basically was offered this job, and he goes to London to go do this job, and he amassed so much debt through poor investments and gambling that the entirety of the family, except for Charles and his older sister Franny, had to go to debtor's prison to work off the debt that his father amassed until basically Charles Dickens' grandfather died, and they inherited some money to get them all out of debtor's prison. Just absolutely insane. He started working at the age of 12, which actually was older than a lot of the children of that time. He had really good penmanship. So his first job was actually labeling different jars of different materials that they used at basically a chimney sweep company.
Yeah, it was a boot blacking factory, what they call it. Yeah. But yeah, he worked 11 hours a day and 6 days a week. He made the grand total of 6 shillings a week.
Yep.
Which was mostly went to pay off his father's debt. Bizarrely, when they inherited money and the family got out of prison, his mother wanted him to stay at the factory because that was at least a steady income they could count on. And Charles was having none of that, and his father agreed with him and sent him back to school.
But he only stayed at school until he was 15. Then he was back to work.
Then he was back to work, his dream in life was to be an actor, which he did eventually fulfill. Yeah. But his first actual job was as a law clerk, again, because of his fantastic penmanship.
Yeah, no, and instead of becoming a lawyer, taking that opportunity that most boys that
which his dad kind of pushed him towards the legal profession.
Well, he's got good penmanship, he's well-spoken, he's definitely smart as a whip. He would have made an amazing lawyer, but we wouldn't be talking about him today if he was a lawyer.
Exactly. He learned the ins and outs of the British legal system.
Yep.
He met so many bizarre and quirky characters, many of whom he would later immortalize in his books. He collected people. Everybody he met, it was fodder for the stuff in his books.
Well, I mean, even the minor characters in his novels, they have some trait that is deeply human, even if it's just a terrible, terrible trait to begin with.
Yeah.
They all feel fully fleshed out, and they feel like they do exist in a three-dimensional world, even when you're reading it in the novel.
A artist who had drawn illustrations for some of his first editions once said that Dickens could describe in detail every single aspect of his fictional characters, how tall they were, what they weighed, what they wore, how many freckles they had in their face. He could also give you the detailed background of where they come from and how they got to where they are in the story, even though most of that information never came into the story.
Yeah, no, that's
so
awesome.
He's one of those writers who created a whole complete fictional world every time he wrote a book.
He feels almost like a dungeon master, where the characters are only interacting with the surface level of the NPCs, if you will, within his world. He was definitely fascinating. Yeah. Can I tell you my favorite fact that I found out about Dickens? It's about his pet raven, or ravens, as I should say.
Okay.
So Dickens owned a raven named Grip, who he loved. He kept it by his writing desk. This raven followed him everywhere. After Grip died from eating lead paint chips, because of course that's the most Victorian way you can go, he got another raven, also named Grip. Grip 2 is said to be the raven that Edgar Allan Poe is writing about in the poem The Raven. And when Grip 2 died, he was, of course, taxidermied and kept on the desk of Charles Dickens, which is just so violently Victorian. I had to include it.
Victorian.
He did a lot of fascinating things in his life. He established a home for fallen women. I did not know that. Granted, the home itself, it was mostly just ex-prisoners, women who had fallen into prostitution. It was basically deciding, are we going to ship you to Canada or Australia or the South Pacific?
Well, prior to that, if you went to one of those places, they immediately put you to work on an assembly line.
Yeah.
So to pay for your room and board, you had to work, just like Dickens did when he was a teenager. And he was having none of that. He wanted a place people could actually go to get off the streets where you wouldn't be worked to death.
It was a Victorian rehabilitation center, essentially, until they could, you basically gotten to a point where you're rehabilitated and you're able to rejoin Victorian society. But it's going to be in one of these places where we're trying to establish a very English colony.
To uplift you, yes.
Yes, exactly. And he was a member of the Historic Ghost Club.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so
he loved the supernatural. Yeah. The supernatural doesn't pop up in a lot of his work, but he was fascinated by it. He was also into mesmerism or hypnotism, as you call it today.
He believed it could cure basic ailments, anxieties. He constantly was trying it on his children and his wife. That poor wife. They were separated eventually, though.
I couldn't get a divorce in those days, but they got separated.
And something fascinating about his burial, which I don't know if you know, but you probably do. He was buried in Westminster Abbey against his wishes.
Yes, I read that.
It was actually to give the Westminster Abbey some cultural significance, which I just find absolutely hysterical. Terrible, but hysterical. What else do you have on my dear Dickens?
Tons of stuff. What he's famous for, apart from his complex plots and ridiculous characters, he creates interesting characters that all have evocative names.
Yeah.
Uriah Heep, Daniel Quilp, and my favorite from Nicholas Nickleby, Wackford Squeers. You only have to hear the name Wackford Squeers to know that he's a rotter. He's just a bad, bad person. But once you hear those names, you never forget them.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, still to this day, Fezziwig. Fezziwig is just a happy character.
He wrote about conditions amongst the poor of London, which was not a popular topic at the time.
No, and there's a lot of social commentary in there, and it's definitely not, it is fictional London, but it's kind of more satirized more than anything. It's looking at it through a different lens, and there is a lot of reality.
He saw a lot of this, both as a law clerk, he saw a lot of legal disputes, and he was a reporter for a while too.
Yeah.
He covered the mean streets of London, as they say.
I did not know he was a reporter.
He was. He worked for the Morning Chronicle.
Oh, really?
Yeah, and that gave him a chance to interview people and write about crime and things like that, which was his favorite topic.
He was a man of the people. He was down in the slums.
He definitely was.
He was kind of like, almost like that Jesus-like figure hanging out with the prostitutes and the criminals and, learning from them. As you said, he was collecting people.
Well, there was a feeling in Victorian era, and sadly still today, that poor people are just, kind of deserve it.
Yeah.
It's their fault they're poor. They're not working hard enough. They're not pulling themselves up by their bootstraps, which I hear politicians say to this very day. And Charles Dickens was having none of that. Those kind of politicians would be bad guys in his books, definitely. Because having come from a good family, full of good, decent people, they still wound up in debtor's prison.
Yeah. They were all hardworking.
Yeah, he still had to work in a factory just to keep his family from starving to death. So being poor is not a moral sin, and that was the message of a lot of his books. He was the first person to actually talk about poverty and the effect that it has on people.
Yeah.
He brought that to public light in a way that no writer before him has ever done. His books are full of grim, horrible things. He describes a grimy, corrupt, and cruel world, but at the same time, it's also weirdly optimistic. They usually have happy endings for most of the characters.
Yeah, which for a Victorian novel, hey, that's kind of uncommon.
One of the reasons why he's still read today is he has that dualistic nature. Yes, life is horrible, but this is the industrial age. Things were changing rapidly, and so Dickens felt if things could change, they could also change for the better.
Yeah.
I like the fact the admirers that he had. Karl Marx once said that Dickens spoke more political truth than all the politicians in England combined.
Yeah, that's fabulous. That's excellent.
And George Bernard Shaw later added to that he found Great Expectations more subversive and dangerous than Das Kapital.
I can see that, actually. Yeah. If you really analyze those works.
He held up a mirror to Victorian England that was not very flattering.
Well, no, especially, that was the way of the world back then. It feels like a three-dimensional world because it was the world he was living in.
Yeah, that was his world.
There are awful, awful things that happen to these characters that I'm sure we'll be delving into in future.
We will delve into as we cover his books.
Yes, and, terrible things happen to people, but just like life, these are virtuous characters for the most part. They're hardworking. You will get a happy ending if you are willing to be virtuous and good. It just might not be the ending you expect.
Yeah. Oscar Wilde sneered at his sentimentality.
That's Oscar Wilde.
That's Oscar Wilde. He had no truck with that.
But yeah, Dickens just, for all of the hardships, all of these awful things, he just, you've got to love him for just keeping optimism throughout all of that. And I know that his novels at the time, they were published in the very common Victorian way that some people might find interesting. They were published in newspaper installments before coming out as a full novel.
Yeah, they were all serialized. He put out one chapter a month, literally, which is why so many of his chapters end on cliffhangers. Yeah.
Oh, it's a nail biter. I can only imagine having to wait for, reading his novels at that time must have felt like waiting for the next, comic book or next, the next volume to come out, and just that torture.
And they were also shipped overseas, of course. He was also popular in America. There's a story, probably apocryphal, that when one of them was running, and it had reached a big cliffhanger, a ship arrived from England, and someone on the dock shouted, "Did little Nell live?" Because he knows they've already read the next installment.
Oh yeah, no, we've been crossing. It's fine. Yeah. There's nothing else to do. Of course, we've read the next installment.
Of course, yes.
Oh, that's excellent.
But yeah, he was enormously popular. Pickwick Papers was his first novel, and he started selling 40 copies a month. And by the time he's done with Pickwick, he was doing 40,000 copies a month.
Yeah. Well, he was also an author where his work was so popularized while he was alive. With some authors, their works really don't hit, international success during their lifetimes. But him, everyone needed to know what was happening. Even when he went over to the U.S., he said he could not round a street corner without being followed by mobs of people, just because they knew Charles Dickens was in town.
Yeah.
I know he also ran into some trouble. He tried to get the U.S. courts to stop the plagiarization of his work.
He was very much opposed to his works being printed illegally in America, with no money going to him. Much like Mark Twain, he was very opposed to someone stealing his work, and the American official at the time kind of sniffed and said, "She'd be grateful for the publicity."
Yeah.
Yeah, no.
Thank us for the exposure. Well, exposure kills.
Yeah, exposure can kill a person. He would give lectures where he would read from his work.
Yeah.
And he was like a rock star. Tickets sold out as soon as it was announced. He also always made sure that there were low price seats for poor people to see him.
Yeah, because he practiced what he preached.
Yeah, completely. But he was enormously popular. He toured America and Canada.
Yeah.
And drew record-breaking crowds everywhere that he went. So he finally fulfilled his dream of being an actor by acting out his stuff in front of an audience.
That's fabulous.
That was so cool.
Well, they don't have a role for me. Gotta write my own.
He's got to write his own, yeah.
Is he one of the first authors to go on an international tour like that?
I don't know. Oscar Wilde did too. He toured America. But certainly he was one of the most successful and one of the most famous that did it.
Absolutely. Fun fact, totally off topic, he loved cats so much. There's a direct quote from Dickens talking about how he never snubbed the presence of a feline companion. Apparently the house was full of cats. I didn't know that. Great. I loved that. I'm sorry to throw it off track.
No, that's perfect. After Pickwick Papers, he did Oliver Twist, which is one of his most popular works. It was his second novel, his second full-length work. It's never been out of print since it came out. Yep. I'll be talking about that in a couple of weeks. Yeah, it with the money he made from his American tour, he helped open the house for fallen women. Yeah.
He also, I believe, he had I'm blanking on the name, but he had a millionaire American heiress also donating to this house. So he he used that influence, all that influence that he accrued over the years, for as much good as possible.
He did. First of all, he pointed out things that were wrong, but never pretended he had a solution.
Yeah.
It was society that had to solve society's problems. He also believed that no one likes being lectured, so he never actually comes out and tells you how bad poverty is. You just watch these characters struggling, to make ends meet.
But that's how you make a difference. You let people draw their own conclusions. You can only show them what's happening, and you have to leave it up to the individual on, okay, how are we going to change this?
Yeah, someone wrote that he had done more to improve conditions of the poor than any other single person.
I believe that.
Yeah.
No, he really, really did. And not only that, just making these characters, not doing the Jane Austen thing of everyone is wealthy, everyone is the worst thing that can really happen to you is that you'll be ostracized from, society. He really shows what it is like for the impoverished.
Yeah, the Regency stuff was extremely isolated with a very narrow point of view. And there are plenty of poor people in the Regency period too, but they just sort of fade into the background. But after Dickens, you really couldn't do that anymore. If you're writing about London, then you have to look at London as a whole place rather than just the parlors and drawing rooms. Yeah.
And even then, most of the villains in his novels have a lot of money.
Yeah.
There are a couple, well-off individuals who, but they're always people who are sharing the wealth. Those are the good people, the ones who have the money, but they're willing to share with, everyone who comes into their home. It's really when you've got all this money and you're not willing to share it, that's the corrupting force for a lot of these characters that I'm really excited to talk about in the coming weeks.
Yes, I can't wait. I mentioned that there's almost always crime and mystery in his works. He only wrote one legit murder mystery, and that was Mystery of Edwin Drood. Of course, famously, he died without finishing it.
Yes, halfway through the 12 installments, he died halfway through, which, oh my goodness, I could think of no worse torture for his readers.
It's awful. To this day, no one knows who killed Edwin Drood. Or if he even died at all. It's
Yeah, who knows? Yeah. Who knows with this guy?
Yeah, there was a Broadway version of that actually had multiple endings.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
That's excellent.
So that is Charles Dickens.
That is Charles Dickens.
And we'll get into his work in greater detail in the coming weeks.
Yep.
Definitely an author to be reckoned with. So until we come back, I have been Ed.
I have been Michaela.
We'll see you next time. Until then, be safe.
Be happy, be healthy. Bye.
Bye.